Uh, Hello, everyone. My name is Paula Boyd. I'm with Microsoft Corporation, and a lot of my time is spent doing telecom issues. But I do support our regulatory affairs folks on internet governance issues. And so just I'm really happy to be here to welcome everyone and welcome ISOC. We've had the good pleasure of hosting for a few panels now on internet governance. And this panel is tremendously timely in the wake of the recent Plenipot. Before handing it over as well, also wanted to say just thank you to a lot of the folks who were involved in the Plenipot, Ambassador Sepulveda and his team who just over weeks and months did a ton of work to prepare for the Plenipot and certainly led the delegation there. And I know that Assistant Secretary Strickling as well as Chairman Wheeler were also present. So just absolute, thank you for all the work that they have done. As a company like ours, there are issues around privacy, data security, cybersecurity, that are of interest to us and that were in play during the course of the Plenipot. And we know that there are other issues such as capacity building, broadband access, global cooperation around internet issues that are also really important and issues that we need to all focus on. Our hope is that industry as well as the internet institutions will continue to be great stewards of the internet, and it will be a process that would include all the various stakeholders and continue to be an open and collaborative process and a transparent process. So we look forward to hearing the discussion, look forward to working with a lot of the folks in the room and all the teams that have worked to advance the issue, and certainly with the new leadership of the ITU. But with that said, look forward to a wonderful and interesting discussion on what has happened and maybe some thoughts on going forward.
Very good. Thank you for those comments. Is it an echo or just me? It's an echo. Uh, there's a little bit of an echo behind me. Okay, I'll keep going. I'm Sally Wentworth. I'm from the Internet Society, and I want to thank first Microsoft for hosting this event and congratulate the DC chapter for putting this together. Judith and David are here, and I know others who are members of the chapter. So thanks for doing that. As was said, it's a very timely event. My job here is to moderate this conversation. We have very good experts on the issues here. And when Judith and I were first speaking about this, I thought we would discuss sort of what a plenipotentiary is and what it looks like. But I think in looking around the room, we've got a lot of people who were either actually there, recognize a number of people, and or are pretty familiar with it. So just to set the stage, especially for people who might be participating remotely, the ITU Plenipotentiary Conference just concluded on November 7th. It was an extremely well-attended event in Busan. It was about, I think the numbers were about 2,200 delegates participated from about 170, more than 170 countries. There were a whole host of proposals. I think the number you said was about over 500 proposals to the meeting. And just a lot of work for the ITU to get through in terms of organizing its activities, its strategy, its budget for the next 4-year period, as well as electing its senior officials, which went several rounds into the first week. So that took quite a bit of time as well. For many of us, this was a conference that we had been focused on for a while because we were interested in understanding how the ITU and its mandate and its scope of work would fit into the broader policy discussion related to the internet, and to what extent the evolution of the internet, the multi-stakeholder model, and all the other pieces that we all know so well in the internet community would be reflected in the outcome of the conference. There was also, I think, fair to say, some concern that if that wasn't the case, that we might see the kind of divisiveness that we've seen in past conferences, and so people were sort of going into Busan, I think, wondering whether this would be more of a normal plenipotentiary conference or whether we would see a renewed sense of division among member states. We can talk about the outcome and whether that happened or not, but it's over. There is an outcome from the conference that was agreed to by consensus in a series of resolutions and the final acts of the Constitution Convention. And there's a new leadership of the ITU that's been elected. And so the work, I think, will continue in the ITU pursuant to those outcomes. So what we're here to talk about today is what happened. What are the things that different parts of our community were focused on going into the conference? What did they pay attention to over the 3 weeks? And then most importantly, I suppose, always is to look forward. Now what does it mean? Can we all pack up our bags and be done with this, or is there more that we need to think about? And that will, I think, of course, help set the stage for 2015 and the kinds of things that will matter in the internet governance space going forward. So what I thought I would do is begin with our panelists, and I should say we have a remote panelist, right? Andrea Sachs is in from, maybe, okay.
She's in audio, and then Paul Mitchell.
And Paul Mitchell. Okay, so Paul is going to let me know what's going to happen if we get her in. Just wave at me if she's on. And I thought we would start with each of our panelists talking about what kinds of things they were focused on, areas of concern going into the conference, and the topics that you're really paying attention to. And then we can move to a conversation about what happened. And I really would invite people to use this as a conversation because so many of the people in the room were either there or following it closely. Happy to take questions and make this really a dialogue because this is an opportunity we shouldn't miss to keep the conversation going. So I'll begin with Fiona Alexander, who's from the Department of Commerce at NTIA. Just remind me of official titles, I'm not as good at that. But maybe you can talk a little bit about, from your perspective, what the focus was and the concerns.
Sure. So I think from our perspective at NTIA and from the broader U.S. government perspective, obviously the Plenipot is it's about a lot of different things, and that's reflective in the proposals the U.S. submitted. We submitted a variety of proposals about transparency and accountability and good governance of the ITU, and many of those were adopted and were very successful in terms of budgeting and things like that. In terms of NTIA specifically, we did spend some time and energy on that, but I in particular focused my energy and concern and work on the internet set of issues, and was lucky to work with both Andrew Harris and Chris Hemmerlein, who are both in the audience. So the three of us, working with a broad range of stakeholders from our delegation, spent, I believe, ultimately it was 50 hours was the total count in the Internet Ad Hoc Group, dealing with 8 proposals on internet issues. There were 4 existing resolutions from previous conferences, and then 4 new proposals. So at the end of the conference, at the end of the 3 weeks, it kind of went by in a blur, but it didn't feel like a blur as we were experiencing it. I think we ended up in a very good spot with just keeping the existing 4 proposals, making some minor updates to reflect advancements in the system and recognition of some of the other stakeholders. And we won't get into too many details because I guess we'll do that later in the conversation, but obviously an opening up of the council working group in the sense of having a stakeholder consultation was a big win. It wasn't exactly what we wanted, but I think at the end of the day, incremental progress, it was good from our perspective. This is my 4th, or was my 4th plenipotentiary. I know Sally's laughing because she was at all 4 of them as well, dealing with the internet issues. And just when I think back on this plenipotentiary versus the other 3 and what the ebb and flow of the conversation has been and the global dialogue and the participation in the room, I was really pleased that, again, it was 50 hours of conversation and 1 ad hoc on 8 resolutions or 8 proposals, which was a lot. But it was really great that there was a lot of support for the principles and the positions that the U.S. Put forward. It was not just the United States that was, espousing these views, and it wasn't even just our traditional, people perceived to be our traditional partners. Europe was very strong, Australia, New Zealand, sort of traditional partners of the United States, but also in the developing world, Ghana was very strong, and Nigeria, and some of our colleagues from Latin America. So that was the biggest shift I'd seen from previous plenipotentiaries, where there really was strong and continued and sustained support for the positions that the United States shared with other like-minded colleagues, and I think was one of the keys to the success that we had in terms of the good outcome that we ended up with. But maybe I'll just leave at that and for an opening.
Okay, very good. Next we have Leslie Martikovich from Verizon. And Leslie, maybe you could talk a little bit about some of the things that industry was focused on at the conference, and where you spent your time both in preparation and during the meeting.
Thank you very much. Happy to do so. And first of all, let me thank Paula and Microsoft for organizing an invitation from ISOC. Very much appreciate it. Thinking of this meeting prior to today, I was struck by how much things have changed. It was also my fourth plenipotentiary, so lots of different changes to some of the resolutions that we spent an awful long time on at this meeting. Hours and hours on the internet resolutions. I think something like 40 plus hours on the WSIS discussions alone, so you go on and on. But from my perspective, from the private sector, looking at this conference, almost any issue, of course, could have an impact on private sector interest. And it's hard to pick out those that really are the most critical. However, let me just run through a very brief list. It's not meant to be exhaustive, and I would welcome, as we start the discussion, from colleagues in the room to add and highlight some more. But I think from our perspective, in looking at some of the classic internet issues, the resolutions that have been with us for years and years now, Resolution 101, I think, was in 2006, the last time we amended it prior to this one, and 102 and others. These resolutions, from my perspective, have potentially far-reaching consequences and also have impact on companies that do business around the world, because they do have operational impact potentially in the way we manage our network. So clearly, I try to track those issues as closely as possible. Those resolutions, I think, came out okay from our perspective. As expected, they were updated with all of the developments that have taken place since the last plenipotentiary, and what I would call powered up by adding a few things in there for future study. But the resolutions really, I think, already have a home in the various study groups, so I think that went relatively smoothly as a number of developing countries push for slight expansion and rounding out of these resolutions to go into study groups that are already looking at these issues going forward. What was a little bit unexpected and turned out to be a challenge, at least from our perspective, was the Indian resolution that came in relatively late in the process. That was very challenging because the content, as I'm sure all of you are familiar with this resolution, had some very far-reaching implications in it, especially for companies that have global networks, looking at data localization, government monitoring of networks, content issues. These are all very difficult issues, and frankly, not issues that the ITU deals with or should deal with anytime soon, in our view. In addition to that, some of the classic views like alternative calling procedures, calling line identification, all of these issues that have been around for many years continue to be with us, and I think will be studied furthermore going in. Our host, Korea, came in with a very ambitious list of things they wanted to accomplish. They came in with a draft resolution that looked at convergence issues, which are very important. They wanted to expand it, looking at some applications, which we had some concerns with, and identification of spectrum specifically for Internet of Things, which of course we had concerns with as well. So working closely within our delegation and with other governments, we had to move very quickly to come up with an alternative way to go forward on these issues. In addition to that, conformity and interoperability for our vendor colleagues has been around a long time, very much a challenging issue, the so-called ITU mark. That came out all right at the end, but still languishing. It's still on the book, so to speak. It's not going away anytime soon. There were a couple of new areas which I wanted to just mention very quickly. One was the whole issue of counterfeit devices, and this issue originally came out of the Americas region from CTEL, and it was originally a proposal from the government of Colombia, who was very concerned about the enormous number of wireless devices, cell phones that were being stored inside Colombia and then reused.
Started by Brazil.
Exported by Brazil, and then reused by various anti-government forces operating inside the government of Colombia. This has morphed over time, and it's become a very convoluted sort of resolution where everybody would put in their own concerns. And we watched this very carefully because what we saw was a sort of a melding, a morphing between this and what I would call consumer protection issues. This is an area for the ITU that's new. So we're watching this one extremely carefully because it could have far-reaching implications as well. And finally, not to forget, the idea that came out relatively late into the process as well from the ITU on numbering resources, which was closely tied in with the ITU budgetary challenges, and I'm sure we'll get to that in due course. But the fact that the ITU will potentially charge for their networking resources and numbering resources caused us a great deal of pause as well. So we watched that very carefully and worked very hard with the delegation and beyond to move the work. Let me stop there.
Oh, that's great, Leslie. And people have asked sometimes, why does this conference need 3 weeks? It's an awfully long time, and trust me, it is an awfully long time. But when you hear that list of issues and you imagine that this large group of countries has to come together in some way to manage and work through all of that long list of issues, and then some, because there are many, many more that Leslie didn't mention. It does give you a sense of the complexity of a meeting like that, where all these issues can be dealt with in parallel, and you have to try to manage the various proposals as they work their way through. So thanks for that list, and I think that was a very comprehensive overview of what the challenging issues were at the conference. I'll look now to Carolina Rosini from Public Knowledge to speak a little bit maybe about a civil society perspective on what was happening at the Plenipotentiary Conference. The issues around access to ITU meetings and ITU documents was a big part of the conversation, and it'd be interesting to hear from civil society how you approached that and then where you think we came out on it, among other topics.
Sure, thank you. So thank you so much for organizing this meeting, and it's always a pleasure to dialogue with you guys. We spent many hours in smaller rooms in the preparation for the ITU, so it was not just the 3 weeks, it was actually months in advance. And I have to confess that I was very concerned in the beginning because I was one of the few from a public interest organization trying to bring some type of human rights or consumer perspective into the rooms, and that at the same time we don't want the ITU going into that direction. The ITU may go in that direction no matter what in some of the working groups and the reports that some of the bureaus do prepare. So it's always important to keep an eye on it. And I think an example that Leslie brought is an example I want to bring later is the counterfeit issue that some people are very, based on a Canadian proposal, some people are a little more comfortable with it, but I'm still not totally comfortable with it. So we're going to touch on that later. So regarding civil society, of course, there are a series of barriers. First is a multilateral meeting, but besides being a multilateral meeting, differently from other UN organizations or other international organizations like WIPO, for example, or even the WTO, you do not have access to documents if you are not participating in a delegation. That has changed slightly during this plenipot, and I said that to many colleagues from other delegations. We were very thankful to the US because they were pushing at the beginning the broadest access. That was not the case at the end, but that was what happened. That was the initial push. So that was very welcoming. So as civil society, we had to take some decisions on should we join some delegations, should we do not join. So at the end, we had a practical decision. We have to join because we want to take a look of what's going on, right? So we joined US, and we had folks that we worked through coalitions like the Best Bits Coalition, for example, and other coalitions that have joined other delegations of other countries. And unfortunately, we had folks that were refused by some governments to join their coalition. So you had folks from Africa joining European delegations just because they were negated the right to be part of their country delegation. So you do have these barriers of participation. Of course, countries that do recognize the multi-stakeholder model, like US and Brazil, for example, it was much easier to approach the delegations, but other countries, like some African countries and European countries, MENA countries, actually, they were much less approachable. So, of course, it's always a barrier, and in some cases, you do want civil society involved because we're going to call this attention for other things through other narratives, but also that makes sense, the end result for companies and government, right? So the first thing was access both for documents, but also for working groups at the ITU, and you had civil society members working on Decision 11, which is working groups, like how the working groups work, and also on access to documents. We also made an effort to have meetings with Ture, which is the exiting Secretary General, and with Mr. Zhao, which is the new Secretary General. And those meetings were really well received. The Zhao one was more intimate, so I think the conversation hopefully is more effective. We just sent 3 days ago a follow-up letter, and I'm happy to share with some of you, making very concrete proposals of how you improve participation. One of the things, for example, is the use of platforms. If ITU is about technology, why you don't use consultation platforms so your consensus is built a little bit before some meetings, right? So that's an obvious small proposition, but there were other propositions. Besides the procedure stuff, of course, we did work on the substantive issues, and I do feel many of you had access to the Best Bits recommendation, which is like a 10-page document with the recommendations. We did the Plenipot. We do evaluate, has the US evaluating his proposals, that our issues were pretty well contemplated in many of the many of the results of the Plenipot, with some exceptions on, for example, spectrum and counterfeit devices. But again, I think ITU is opening up its working groups, and Zhao team has said that they do want to do open consultations with a variety of stakeholders also in those issues in the working groups coming out of Plenipot. So this is a general issue, and I do want to call attention for two things, and it was amazing. It was hours, and over the weekend from 8 a.m. to 10 p.m. I joke that at face value was one of the most boring meetings ever, but actually if you look at it and if you follow the language, it was amazing. Like, I was amazed. I could actually stay there long. Maybe not. But it was amazing to see the power plays happening there at the corridor and during the formal meeting. So who likes international relations and international negotiations? It was like amazing, much more subtle than negotiations at WIPO and WTO, for example. Extremely much more subtle. It's really interesting. But anyway, so on counterfeit, I do want to call attention for the resolution, the new resolution on counterfeit, because it still brings an issue of unauthorized devices. It brings an issue under the recognizing or something. I don't want to bother you. I brought the text. If anybody want to see the real language, is not on the resolve part, not on the instruction part, but it still is there. And from a freedom of expression and human rights perspective, if you have a phone that's considered unauthorized and that phone is shut down, it may cost the life of somebody, depending on the country, or the right of assembly of that person, or the right of expression of that person. So we still have some concerns on how this unauthorized is going to play, even not being in the the ITU part. So that's one of the issues, and we know that just last week there was a working group meeting in Geneva on this, so we are hoping to hear back from that and see what's going on. Another thing I do want to bring attention to is Resolution 140, which is the follow-up of WISIS. So if you read 102 and 140, with the council resolutions they mention, like the 1335 and 1304, they still put the ITU as a core actor on internet policymaking. So when we were all worried at the weekend, ITU is going to control internet, and go into the Plenipot, ITU is going to control internet. There is a lot of language that gives ITU a lot of space and scope to do that work, and even if it's not a concrete like a technical task or something very concrete. It is to provide capacity building or study. When you provide capacity building or you develop a study, you do provide recommendations within that, right? So they do have something there that I think we should keep an eye on. So these are my two main concerns now. I have to confess that myself and civil society from everywhere is still digesting this, but I think that's how we see all this moving forward. The WISIS procedures will start again next year around June, so then we're gonna see what's gonna happen here.
So I think we'll come back to the WISIS in a moment, because I think that's where this train is maybe heading next if we have a stop in Busan. But before we wrap up specifically on the Plenipot, I wanted to touch on maybe a few of the more specific issues and maybe have a conversation here about Busan and then think about what's next. Fiona, you mentioned that you considered it a pretty big win to have the Council Working Group on Internet issues more open. Maybe you can walk through a little bit of what the nuance of that is, because depending on how you read it, there was a complex, I think, text kind of tossed in at the end, and maybe you can walk through what you think that means or what you're looking for.
Sure. So for those not familiar with the ITU Council working groups, historically they're open to member states and sector members, although over the years it's changed a little bit. And this particular Council working group on Internet public policy related issues, I think I might have missed a word in the title, it's very long, actually used to be a subgroup of the WISIS Council Working Group a few years ago. Yeah. And at the Plenipotentiary in Guadalajara was made a standalone group and was made a member state only group, so that was closed to even sector members of the ITU couldn't go in their own right. Now anyone can bring anyone on their delegation, and the United States, as common practice, always allows people to come on our delegation. So other stakeholders could participate as part of our delegation, but they couldn't participate in their own right, even sector members of the union. So we had gone into the conference with a proposal to open up, and this is the Decision 11 argument, which is, again, there's a lot of people in the room that were at the meeting, and for those of you that weren't, if anytime anyone uses an acronym or a term that doesn't make sense, just wave and we'll stop to explain it a little bit more. But Decision 11 sort of sets some of the work methods of these council working groups, and we had proposed as the United States in our bid to make the ITU more open and transparent and accountable to have all council working groups be open to ITU members, both member states and sector members. And if the council working group was going to be looking at Internet issues, to have an opportunity to be a little bit more open. We had gone into the CTEL region and proposed complete openness, and that caused some concern amongst our CTEL colleagues, and we talked it through with them, and we came in with a slightly different proposal about consultations and making it a little bit more open. Our colleagues in Europe actually went in with a make it open to all stakeholders contribution, and then our colleagues from the Arab region said, let's keep it open only to member states. So that started the bidding of the conversation at the conference in terms of how the group would actually work. At the end of the day, I think, again, it's not exactly what we would like in terms of having a discussion on Internet issues be open to all stakeholders. From our perspective in the U.S. government, multi-stakeholder is what we believe in, not because it's something to believe in, but it's because we think it's the best way to actually get to good policy and good outcomes when it comes to Internet issues. And so that involves transparency, participation, openness, and that's always what our goal is with respect to not just ITU, but all the different Internet issues that we do. And we tried to be true to those ideals and take that into the ITU. The ITU is, at the end of the day, an intergovernmental institution and needs to reflect the views of the full membership. And where we ended up with was having a full day before the council working group meets to have a stakeholder consultation, having the agenda of the council working group made known in advance so that stakeholders could provide input into that. And then this way we allow openness and some deliberation and some input from other stakeholders. I'll look to Andrew or Chris if they want to sort of elaborate more on the details. I mean, implementation of this still has to be worked out, so we'll see how this unfolds going forward. But my one observation of this from the last 14 years is that when Sally and I, when she was at the State Department, when we first started doing the WISIS process, I remember getting instructions, and you probably remember this too. We were sent into these ad hoc groups for drafting, and as the United States, we all had to make the same intervention before the meeting started, which was to express our disappointment that the group was only member states. Because when the WISIS first started, stakeholders were not allowed in the room either. And over the course of the 5 years of the WISIS process, the discussions became more and more and more open. And I'm hoping that with the small opening of the ITU and stakeholders being able to participate and provide input, maybe we'll start down that track with that. And which is why, the specific modalities of how this is going to work is going to have to be worked out with council and when the group actually convenes. But I really would encourage all of you that are interested in this to pay attention and take the opportunity and participate. Again, I found over the years that once you allow people to show up and give them a voice, if they take that opportunity and to express themselves, it tends to lead to a broader opening and a broader understanding and a broader awareness. Did you guys have anything you wanted to? Okay.
Well, thanks for that. And I do think from our perspective, from ISOC, watching that discussion unfold, it is a step forward. I think we need to see, of course, how the new Secretary General, the new leadership decide to implement this. And it could go any number of ways, but hopefully it will be more inclusive and more open. That's I think, what the text aims for. So hopefully that's what it results in. Maybe what I could do is, if there are comments or observations from the audience, there are two so far, and there's a microphone here. I don't know, does somebody want to hand this? I don't know, I think it's on. It's on. Can you hand? I would like to take comments right now on what happened in Busan, any questions you might have for the panelists, comments about the dialogue there, and then what we'll do is maybe do a round with the panel.
People participating remotely.
Oh, great. Has Andrea? We can't get Andrea. Okay. And then you'll let us know if there are comments through the chat.
Somebody else probably watching the live stream.
Oh, okay. So let's take comments now on what happened in Busan, and then I'd like to at least ask the panelists to begin thinking about what happens next. So if you can introduce yourself, that'd be great too.
My name is Rob Latin. I'm from the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and I was also in Busan for a few days. Just a question about reconciling the openness of this council working group on the internet versus the American position of trying to basically keep internet talk outside of the ITU on certain issues. Isn't there a concern that I understand the multi-stakeholder aspect of this and being inclusive in the sense that that'll help generate consensus on lots of issues, but could that be construed as somewhat short-sighted, and in the long term we'd be worried that these other issues may be exploited within this working group?
Does anybody want to?
I'll start if anyone else wants to add in. I think the reality is that the ITU, we tend to talk about the ITU as an institution in and of itself, and it's not. The ITU is a reflection of the 191 member states that participate, and it used to be 700 some sector members, but it may not be that many anymore. And so the institution really is bottom up and is driven by the needs of its membership. And is it my preference that we talk about internet issues at the ITU? Absolutely not. But other countries and other people are going to bring the issues there. It's bottom-up process, it's membership-driven, and you can't stop or prohibit a conversation. So with that in mind, we would like to make sure that to the extent those conversations are going to happen, they're the best informed they can be, and they're the most open they can be, and they can actually help, alleviate some of the concerns and address internet policy in a way that's practical. It remains to be seen what happens with this opening of this group next year. But the ITU should be credited with making a small step. Over the last couple of years, we've made actually, I would think, big progress in opening up ITU. I know both Chris and Andrew were very much involved in the preparations for the World Telecommunications Policy Forum, and there was an informal experts group, and that was very, very open, much more so than this council working group is, by the way. And then also there was I always get this acronym wrong, the MPP, the Multi-Stakeholder Participatory Platform.
Yeah, MPP.
Yeah, that others in the room participated in. Carolina, Marilyn, and Chris and others. I wasn't there. And that was much more open and multi-stakeholder than this council work as Ruby's been doing. And I think people were pleased with the outcomes of that. So I think there's a risk in anything, but the reality is that the conversations are going to take place, so we should try to make sure they take place in the most informed manner possible.
I also think it's important that, from my view, that the stakeholders have a right to be in the room in their own right if they can. Carolina pointed to the difficulties that many stakeholders have in getting on national delegations. The U.S. has traditionally had a very open process. That's not necessarily the case around the world. You had challenges, our chapter members had challenges as well. So the ability to actually be in the room, I think, matters. But I think you have a very valid point that we should be very vigilant about how broad that discussion gets. Absolutely. If anybody, Leslie, you want to?
Maybe just add a very quick thought on that, because it's a very good question. We'll have to see how it goes. I think that a little bit of a history to this, I recall back to the last World Telecommunication Policy Forum, where Brazil got up and said, well, where do we go in the ITU to discuss internet issues? Where do we go? Of course, the answer to that was the Council Working Group on Internet. So we will see how that goes forward. As a model, let me point out something that I think could be an evolutionary process for that group. Whether it happens or not, I don't know. But when Hamidou Touré became the director of the development sector, one of the first things that he started was the Global Symposium for Regulators, the GSR. And they've had about 11 of these so far. And it started as a very closed group. It started as a group where over a 3-day meeting, 2 days were closed to nothing but government officials and regulators, and 1 day was opened up for industry and others to participate. That has now been flipped completely. So now we have 2 days that are open and 1 day for government only. And in my discussions with regulators, I'm finding that they like this new model. The fact that they can interact with industry and other experts has been helpful to them. But the Council Working Group, of course, is a slightly different animal because it is the place where governments feel that they can go to have these conversations. But we'll have to see how that evolves going forward.
Yeah, and just 2 quick points. One thing is that political statements will happen at the ITU no matter what regarding internet policy. So you saw the India proposition, which, in my opinion, was much like it scared everybody. It was last week. It was the last week of Plenipot. Everybody thought everything was calm enough, and then suddenly the India proposition came. And the Brazil proposition that brought at the first time the privacy and surveillance issues that were negated at CITEL, but then came back slightly in a reformed Brazilian proposition. But also I think Iran had some proposals that brought privacy specifically. I don't remember, I do think it's Iran. So you have that environment for political statements, which may be interesting because then you're gonna see how what are the trends within some countries, and that they may act on those things if it's not the ITU somewhere else, right? So we know that Brazil and Germany were supposed to table something today on privacy, and that didn't come forward, but may come anytime, right? Another thing is that many developing countries, they need a place that they know they can ask for help. So where are you going to go? You're going to go to the ITU, or you're going to go to the Net Mundial initiative? So you have to see, or where else, right? So you have to see where these people can ask for help if they need help on technical issues, right?
Okay, so I think Marilyn, you have the microphone? Okay.
I do. Thanks, Sally. My name is Marilyn Cade. I'll just open my comments by saying I've been a partial attendee at more than 4 Plenipots, and I have spent a good amount of my time participating in the ITU in a number of places, Study Group 2, Study Group 3, been on many delegations dealing with the council working groups, participated in the MPP, participated in the WSIS Plus 10, and in the Wicked Prep, and et cetera, et cetera. I was on the Secretary General's high-level expert group on cybersecurity. I am astounded by something that did not happen at the ITU, and I'm astounded by the way all of the governments responded. And what I've been hearing from all of you is, okay, here's what we achieved, but I'm going to talk about what we didn't achieve at the ITU. We actually, there are a number of middle states that do want access to the internet, and they want to improve access for their citizens. I don't think that either the ITU or the Net Mundial initiative are necessarily the only places to go. We might also include the Internet Governance Forum and the national and regional IGFs and other activities. But here's what happened at the ITU that astounded me. I'm a business person. Second week, We learned that the ITU has a significant financial shortfall. When business gets that news, or an association gets that news, we stop everything we're doing. We call all hands together, and we right-size the business. We put a freeze on hiring. We stop expanding our regional offices. We stop spending money on travel. We pull back and we right-size. I expected that to happen at the ITU, and that is not what happened. And I am going to say I am very disappointed in every government about the fact that that was not dealt with. Instead, we reached into our pocket, even though there's a $200 million deficit at the ITU. And we reached into the reserve fund, and we decided to keep doing more and more and more and more. And even after that news came, and we kept accepting, I was there, we kept accepting new language, expanding the work of the ITU in many, many areas. We took a portfolio, which was the size of my iPad, which we don't have the money to fund because we have a financial shortfall. We expanded it by 5 times, and we approved it. It astounded me that the governments did not demand more financial rigor. And I have my own view about whether I think the Council Working Group on IPP is a Trojan horse, and it's going to have a lot of attention paid to it because of the 17 items that are there. It's very possible that this 3 meetings a year consultation process is actually going to compete for time and energy with the work we need to do at the IGF. So we're going to have to think about whether we as business really want to resource that, or we want to try to not resource it and focus on an offensive approach of building solutions at the IGF, Net Mundial, blah, blah, blah. Also focusing on broader issues that are more positive, that we need to understand. This is an internet governance landscape. It's not just the ITU. There's a significant report coming out of UNESCO. We'll see the first draft of that the first week of March, which includes looking at the ethical uses of the internet and internet as a right. Those are really important issues that 191 countries who are members of UNESCO care about. So I'm kind of looking at what happened at the ITU and thinking the ITU fits into only a small part of the answers. But I want to go back to why have we not dealt with the financial issues here? Because that organization is facing huge problems financially while they continue, and it's very irresponsible, I think, to continue to expand the work of the ITU when they can't pay their bills and perhaps mislead the developing countries on what the ITU can do.
Does anybody, I don't know if anyone on the panel wants to talk a little bit. There was quite a significant, and first, thank you, Marilyn. I think that was a very strong, but I think it was very good. I mean, a lot of people were walking around thinking, you know, there's a conversation happening on budget in a room down the hall while we're in a different room, and things seem to be growing. And it's always a challenge with a policy meeting like this to reconcile that. But there were other proposals. The numbering proposal that came up, Leslie, you touched on it a little bit. Would you be able to speak to that so people have a sense of the kinds of things the conference was thinking about? Because at least my thinking in ITU and in this whole space is no good idea ever goes away, good or bad idea, so you should expect things to live on.
Maybe we should start with why there is a budget shortfall.
Yeah, maybe
which
that's
is,
a good question.
There was a predicted budget shortfall coming into the conference, which is what this numbering proposal was supposed to do. But also, one of the mundane things that happens at the ITU Plenipotentiary, in addition to the elections, is member states actually have to establish what their contributory unit's going to be. Unlike other parts of the UN where you're assessed, the ITU member states decide how much they're going to contribute to the Union. The United States is still a 30-unit contributor to the ITU. I think it's just us and Japan, is that right? That are the 30 units, and each unit's worth 320,000 Swiss francs. That's remained stable for a while. 330? Well, yeah, so I'm not the budget person, so I'll look to my other colleagues in the audience if they are. But what happened is that you're coming in with a smaller shortfall anyway, and then over the course of the conference, when member states had until the second week to actually say how much they were going to contribute. A few member states increased their contributory units, but several decreased them. So I think the extent of the budget shortfall was somewhat unexpected, based on the conversations I heard from the podium from the leaders of the ITU as a result of this. Again, I'm not the expert in the budgeting set of issues, and I don't know if anyone, the folks in the room are not either from the State Department, other parts of the government. My understanding, though, is that we did approve a biennial budget, so we agreed for 2 years, and there's a set of conditions, and there's supposed to be a variety of discussions about cost-saving measures. So I do think the ITU has challenges with the budget going forward, but I think it's, I'm not quite sure it's accurate to say that it was completely irresponsible to say that governments didn't impose some cost-cutting structures and processes to get to those going forward. Implementing those is important, but I'm not quite sure that people didn't actually take it seriously. But maybe you want to speak to the INR proposal and the concern that folks had on that and explain a little bit more.
Not too much more because it will bore everybody to tears. But of course, Marilyn is right. Governments that are active in the ITU want more and more projects to be undertaken. And we see this time and again. It doesn't have to be a plenipotentiary. It could be almost any meeting that has control over the purse in the ITU. As a matter of fact, I was talking to the leaders of one of the regional offices whose responsibility it is to implement these projects in that region. And he told me, frankly, said, I have half the money that I need, so I can do half the projects that I've been tasked to do. I can't do any more. I don't have the funds for it. So that's a fact of life. So the ITU, I think, is going to have to take a very, very close look at its budget, its priorities, and its expectations. And I think that the new Secretary General will do this in relatively early part of 2015. He actually, I think, will actually start the process. I think it has to be done. It has to be done. And we will have to track very closely, and I'm speaking to other colleagues from industry especially, track very closely what is going to be happening within the subgroups of the ITU Council that deals with human resources, that deals with financial and budgetary issues, to see what is going on there. Even though we may not be able to participate, we need to track that as closely as possible to see where these priorities may be going and how they may be changing. Change they will, but we have to, I think, keep a very close eye on what they think is going to be key issues going forward. I assume, from what I've been hearing, WSIS will be a big item for the ITU. And when we get to the point of our conversation about the future, there'll be a few others that I'd like to mention as well. And I think resources will be found to track those issues and be involved with those issues. I think we need to track those carefully.
Yeah, and just a quick comment on that. Actually, if you read all the resolutions and decisions, they actually bring if the budget permits or something like that. So I think that is not done yet. So whenever something is going to be established, I hope the countries play a watchdog role on budget there.
Can we try to go to Andrea Sachs? Is that okay?
Yeah,
Can
is she
let
on?
me see if I can bring her in with audio. Just one moment.
Do you want to introduce Andrea Sachs before she's coming on, Judith?
Yes, hi. Andrea is she leads the U.S. and a lot of ITU issues on accessibility, and so she was working really hard, both on the U.S. delegation and others, to make sure that the internet is available to people who are low vision or deaf or any type of disability issue. And this is something that's really near and dear to a lot of the people, a lot of priorities that the U.S. has and other people have. And so she's based in London, but so she's a champion on those issues.
Thank you. Andrea, are we
contributing
here?
really late.
Is she here? Okay. Maybe we're not going to get her. Okay, wave at me if she comes through.
So just back on the budgeting stuff, so that the magic phrase generally is within existing budgetary resources, and we tend to generally put that into almost every activity or resolution at the ITU. I do think that next year's council meeting will be critical. Julie Zoller is going to be the vice chair of council and then be leading into being chair of council the following year. our colleague from the State Department, so that will be important. And then Vernita Harris, at our team at NTIA, is actually vice chair of the finance and admin group. So we are very well positioned to make sure that we take a good hard look at these things, and I imagine we will be as it goes forward. We have historically had a policy of cost recovery at the ITU, and for those, it's not the Internet Society crowd probably not is interested in satellite network cost recovery, and its own it has its own acronyms like SNCR and things like that. In terms of making sure that this is not a revenue generating activity at the ITU, and we've historically opposed revenue generation of the institution. The INR issue was a proposal from the newly elected Deputy Secretary General, but head of the TSB, for the ITU to charge for telephone numbers as a revenue generation mechanism. And we successfully, our colleague from the FCC, Al Lewis, made many interventions to successfully beat that back as a construct. But again, the council working group and the council itself will be taking a look at the budgeting issues. And as I understand it, and you may remember this a little bit more than I do, that Plenipot itself, it's a 4-year budget cycle, but it approved a 2-year budget. So we have not approved a budget for 4 years, it's just 2 years. And a part of this includes a very lengthy discussion about searching for specific cost reduction and savings exercises. Just like all things at the ITU and quite frankly everywhere, it will require dedication and diligence to make that happen. But again, I'm confident that both Julie and Vernita will make this priorities. And for those of you interested in that, I'm sure the State Department will be running preparatory process for all of that, and you can participate.
I know. We have another question from a remote. We have about 58 people on the remote webcast, and we're having a big talk on this on some issues. A couple people raised the points on that the ITU, there was a lot, particularly at Sally on all ISOC, and saying is that a lot of developing countries raise capacity building issues. And what can ISOC do to help out the developing countries with these capacity building issues? And
Okay.
so.
Well, and it's interesting, tie into some of the budget discussions. One of the points that the Internet Society made going into this conference was that we would like to see the ITU positioned more as a partner and a collaborator in the ecosystem, right? So where it has a role and responsibility, it should seek to carry out that role in collaboration with other stakeholders and partners. And by that, it's a sense of we all can't do everything. And there are these networks of organizations and individuals and expertise that live both inside the ITU but outside the ITU. And so where it might be an interesting development is in light of budgetary challenges that lots of organizations face. Maybe this is an opportunity for the ITU to partner and to work with other organizations to carry out some of the very things that a lot of developing countries were raising in terms of capacity building, best practices, figuring out how to get the information and the resources that they're looking for. So from Internet Society's perspective, of course, we have a very keen organizational interest in working in a lot of local communities to bring the internet. Maybe we don't deliver the internet, but to create the conditions where the internet can succeed. So building technical capacity of the local technical community to help build and sustain and grow the internet in the community, the policy capacity of both the decision makers and the community around those decision makers. And so I actually think there's a lot of space in what the countries were proposing, whether it's about internet exchange points or about other pieces of affordability or creating the local policy environment. I think where Internet Society and the broader internet community can be partners and should be. So that it may be an interesting opportunity that emerges from that, but we'll have to see, obviously if the ITU acts on it.
And just to complement, that was actually one of the things we mentioned to Zhao. I was very surprised to know that APC, the Association for Progress Communication, actually helped to take the first internet connection to Brazil in the Rio conference more than 2-3 decades ago. So civil society and public interest organizations also have a lot of expertise, both on policy development and training. I do online training forever in internet governance to actually helping that. So that was one of the things that we offer within the expertise of our organizations to also support the ITU on that sense. But we have to see how that gets implemented, as you said.
Okay, so I think we're trying one more time.
Yeah, well, actually, I'm just going to ask a question for her because she typed it
Oh,
into the
okay.
chat here. We can't get her on audio, but regarding the budgetary issues, she was asked earlier about what the room thinks about the possibility of either a new building regarding the financial expenditure, as this will impact how accessibility is implemented, and she also kind of added in there about whether the old building could be remodeled. So she was asking about those comments.
I will say these are things that go beyond the Internet Society's expertise, but I don't know if anybody else has.
Where's your design degree?
But it is an important point. It has serious budgetary implications, and I think, as Andrea says, there's the ITU buildings are a challenge exist currently to actually navigate and get around. I mean, it is actually a very serious and a serious issue from a participation point of view and a serious issue from a budgetary perspective. So Marilyn might.
Just real quick, it's Marilyn Cade. So just for an overview of background, the ITU has three buildings that are, two buildings that are interconnected by a third building called the Burumbay building. And so some of you may be familiar with the image of the ITU Tower. That also has a building called the Montbrilliant building, and in between those is the Burumbay building. The Burumbay building is largely empty, okay? It is not actually fully occupied right now. Most of the problems for accessibility are in the tower, where there's not elevator access to all of the meeting rooms. There are other problems about accessibility. The cost of replacing the Burumbay building is quite significant, and the Swiss government representative has even indicated that the budget the ITU staff have put forward doesn't even completely cover the cost of replacing that building. The building has to be torn down, replaced. It cannot be refurbished. The tower is within need of updating. The exterior apparently has to be updated in order to meet Swiss code. There are other changes that need to take place in the tower itself. In order to do that, the ITU will have to move staff out and find additional facilities to put that staff in while they either replace the Burumbay building or and the sequence is move people out of Burumbay, replace it, and then deal with the tower. It's a very complicated process, and the actual financial cost is not totally understood yet. To Andrea's point, when those changes happen, Swiss code it needs to be really focused on that the changes do bring the facilities up to adequate standards to be able to deal with people with disabilities. But the getting there is probably a multi-year problem. There is space in some of the other UN sister agencies that the ITU could possibly use space in. There's also a kind of a weird proposal from one of the member states that perhaps they could offer to temporarily house some of the ITU staff in a different location. That will provide a major challenge to the work of the study groups, et cetera. But to Andrea's point, it's a very complicated, probably multi-year problem, and financing the buildings has not been thoroughly dealt with. I'm just going to say one more thing. The ITU has the ability right now to take what I call off-budget financing. And so maybe that's one other thing to kind of think about in terms of the cost recovery and also the implications for how they fund things.
So I'm going to switch now. This is I want to move just in the few minutes we have left to a discussion of now what. So that's always the most important. So we've lived through the Plenipotentiary conference. It's the outcome was adopted by consensus. Now what happens? There's been reference already up here and in the room about WSIS, references to the IGF. So why don't we talk a little bit, and of course then the ITU work itself, right, the council working groups, both on WISAs on internet issues, all of the cybersecurity discussions that happened. So there's a lot that we have to monitor within the ITU itself. So Carolina, maybe I'll start with you. You started to reference the WISAs discussions. You want to talk a little bit about what you see on the horizon, either as a result of the Plenipotentiary Conference, but in general on the international internet governance?
Sure. For us, it's a very easy decision to make. How many resources we have, and how impactful is a certain forum, and if we're gonna invest our very, 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 very scarce resources from civil society on that. So you guys have been to tons of plenipots. What actually comes out of it, right? That's a question that we need to have answered, because while a lot of language here still worries me, that's my lawyer hat, does anything here really becomes true? And if it becomes true, what are the venues for that? Are the working groups, right? If so, which ones? Which ones is just talking and which ones actually build an international narrative, which also is important, right? I call it cumulative innovation, right? It's important to be part of process that generate cumulative innovation, right? But there are other ones that may be a little more breakthrough, right? I think Net Mundial in Brazil, not the current effort, was a big breakthrough in some level. In that sense, I do see some things for next year, and we are now actually in the effort of mapping. I don't know if you guys saw it, and I can provide Chuaizok to put it up online. We did do a mapping of forums in 2014 and how they impact each other and how the resolutions move from one to another. So hopefully we're gonna replicate that exercise, and it's gonna come online interactive, so you can actually navigate all the websites and content. That was an effort of folks from Brazil, Deborah Brown and Leah from Global Partners, so there were a couple of people taking care of that. So we're hopefully going to replicate all that to help civil society navigate all the acronyms. The other one is the WISIS process that actually is going to come back in June next year. And the idea is to actually start a consultation in civil society on some of the core questions that come from the WISIS plus 10 questionnaire and things like that. So this is another thing we're going to look into. Another thing that I've been observing is that the new trend is cybersecurity. And I'm very worried with that, because people just change names to talk about the same thing. So we may look at the Hague conference to see if it's not going much broader than hardcore cybersecurity, and see how that's going to impact things. And of course, we do keep an eye on the UN General Assembly regarding the moves of Brazil and Germany. So those are some of the things we are looking at to follow in 2015.
Very good.
Of course, through collaboration of this coalition of civil society, not just...
I mean, that's really important. It's very difficult to track these things. When you have a major event like a plenipotentiary, it's hard to track within it, but at least you know where it's happening. It's in Busan, it's 3 weeks, you know where to go.
And one thing that does not come up much in these forums, but we do track through other coalitions more focused on intellectual property, is actually the trade agreements. Right. A lot of the things that come on internet governance and are actually binding because they come through multilateral treaties, they are being dealt in trade agreements. So the TPP and the TTIP and the liquid IP chapter does show that. You see IG-related provisions in the intellectual property chapter, in the e-commerce chapter, in the service chapter. So it surprises me many times that a lot of folks in the IG community do not look over to that, but that's another thing we do follow.
Very good. Leslie, what's your perspective looking forward?
Well, I think just very briefly, this plenipotentiary to me had a very different feel than the previous two, for example. The participants were relatively well behaved. The media more or less thought it was a relatively successful outcome. End of the day, all that is true. But I think there are reasons for that, and I think some of the reasons I think have a way of pointing us to the future. And of course, the exiting Secretary General wants to make sure that he leaves a positive legacy.
Sure.
Leave an organization after many years, 16 years in a leadership position. The new Secretary General coming in wanted a good, positive outcome from this meeting to start his tenure early next year. Nobody wanted another wicked meltdown. That was generally agreed. Uh, Also, in my conversations with governments over the 3-week period, there was also a feeling that there are other important issues on the move, and it was unsure how the outcome of these issues will impact the ITU going forward, and what kind of role will the ITU have in the future because of these. And some of them we touched on before, and they're very important. And of course, the WISIS plus 10 discussions, as we mentioned, are going to be critical because the high-level meeting in New York come December of next year will be very interesting and indicative of what will the ITU look like in this space. Because remember, we're moving from the Millennium Development Goals to the Sustainable Development Goals. So we're looking at a new paradigm. Well, how is the ITU going to fit into this new paradigm? I think it's going to be very interesting, very important. All of the surrounding preparations for the next Internet Governance Forum are very important, and many governments are watching this very carefully. They want to see how the Net Mundial model is going to play in to the IGF in Brazil or not. I think they're very keen on watching what's going to happen there. And again, what kind of outcome will that indicate for the ITU going forward? And finally, the issue of the IANA transition. Are watching that one very carefully as well. So in a sense, this meeting was, I don't want to call it a, quiet in the eye of a storm, but more of an interregnum. It was an unusual meeting. I think people are watching what's happening. They want to see what the options are for the future. And of course, we shouldn't forget that come 2018, I can't wait, for the next plenipotentiary, we're going to have brand new leadership. That's important because the people that are in leadership positions today have been around there for a long time. Many of them will not be able to run again. There will be age issues. There's only one person among the new leadership now who's relatively young, Chase Subley, coming in as director of the TSB. He has some years ahead of him. But the others, we'll see. So this could have, I think, some far-reaching implications as well. Thank you.
Very good. Fiona, what are you watching?
So what are we focusing on for next year? There's always a lot in internet governance. Every year is a busy year. Don't ever let anyone tell you any year is worse than the other. They're always busy. I think, but from NTI's perspective and our team in our international office, some priority activities for us next year, direct from Plenipot, will be these council working groups, not just the council working group on internet public policy, but also the council working group on WISIS, and this issue with the budgeting at the council itself and the financial group. So those are going to be some ITU priorities we'll be dealing with. I started out by saying that I thought one of the interesting things, and I was really pleased by, was that there was a lot of support for the sort of principles and approach and commitment to the multi-stakeholder model from a lot of participants at the Plenipot that I hadn't seen before. It's just a strong sense of it. And that's because from my perspective and from sitting back and looking at this a little bit, there's a lot of activity that's happening, and the international community and different parts of the international community feel much more ownership and participation and involvement in the multi-stakeholder processes that exist. That's a credit to Sally and the work ISOC has done to bring people to the IETF and explain how the IETF works. I know you have a grid program that does that. Credit to ICANN for changing some of the way that it works, opening things up. The GAC has translation. I think they doubled the fellowship of government participants 3 or 4-fold. I mean, so the internet institutions, the traditional ones, have done a lot of work over the last 2 or 3 years to really be more open. So I think people, what I saw in Busan is a reflection of that. The INET transition and the way the international community and the multi-stakeholder community has embraced that and is working. I think there's a group meeting in Frankfurt today, if I recall. So that's going on, and that's great. And then the IGF and the successes of the IGF and Net Mundial. So all those activities that people have found themselves in and are finding answers and finding solutions and finding ways forward means there's a lot of work, right? So for next year, like I said, we have the ITU stream of activities. We'll have the preparations for the IGF in Brazil. There'll be the preparations for the WISIS plus 10 review, culminating with the meeting in December at UNGA. So there'll be a lot of preparations and steps along the way for that. There'll be the Net Mundial initiative, the one that's been recently launched, and our involvement in that and scoping that as we go forward. And then, there's also other activities. Trade agreements, we actually do participate and follow those at NTIA. So we're very much aware of the internet governance components of that. So we'll still continue to do that. We're kicking into high gear in a few weeks preparations for an OECD ministerial on internet issues in 2016. So there'll be a lot of preparation for work for that next year. And there's also an APEC ministerial in April, May, TBD, an APEC ministerial next year. So again, and I'm sure there's things I'm forgetting in this list that I've just done. So, continuing improvements efforts and work at ICANN, obviously the ANA transition, particularly important to NTIA. But again, there's a lot happening and there's always a lot to do. And I think to the question Marilyn or concern raised earlier, it's important to figure out where to prioritize and where to work with others and where to be involved. There's never not a meeting somewhere you can go to if you want to go to. The question is figuring out what's the best one and how to use your resources to do it.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting, if you go back, we always try to figure out from whence we came, and the internet policy issues sort of emerged on the scene at WSIS, and now it's a nonstop. And it's important to say, these activities we just outlined are very much sort of at the global level or even regional APEC, OECD, but there's also, the impression that I got at Plenipot was there was a discussion happening in the room, but there was also a lot of engagement by countries with various parts of I want to call it the internet community, and I can speak for ISOC, but there were a lot of conversations about how do we find out more about how to do something, or how to if it's IPv6, it's a topic, or if it's connectivity and internet exchange points, it's a topic. There were a lot of those conversations where countries are saying, at the local level, in my country, we are looking for information on how to do this. And I think it's really important to keep that in mind as we look at all these various global meetings. There's still a very, very critical component of that happens at home, right? The policy bubbles up into this global context because we have questions about what's happening, or we have ideas about what's happening, or observations from what happens at home. And so making sure that we are engaged at that level as well, I think is hugely important to inform those discussions that happen at the global or regional level. So with that, I think we have hit our time. Is that right?
I know Sally has to go early, but if people maybe if people want to continue to discuss, they can.
And we can certainly continue the discussion in the room.
Right.
But I think what I'll do is I will thank the panelists. I'll thank all of you in the room. Certainly at the Internet Society, we care a lot about these issues and really care about the open exchange of ideas and information. DC chapter has been a great venue for that here in Washington. Thanks again to Paula and Microsoft for hosting this, and we will see you online, and maybe we can continue the conversation in the room.
And thanks so much for all coming out here in the cold weather, and also we wanted to also tell you that our next Internet Society event is going to be on December 1st, and it's going to be in partnership with the Elliott School, and it's going to be towards a trusted identity in cyberspace, and it's being arranged by other council member Steve Miller, who's in the back. And so that should be a really exciting panel discussion, and stay tuned. And for those who missed the beginning of this, it can be all watched on a live stream, on the live stream channel, or on the ISOC TV channels. I know some people had problems connecting early on, but it can be replayed and watched over again if you missed different parts. And if you have any specific questions, you can try to address them to us, and we can try to get them answered by the panelists. But I wanted to thank everyone for coming, and just come to see us on our next event or our next happy hour.
Thank you.
This is so hard, right? Just doing this.
At your table.
Yeah. I was using it.